In the 2nd century, a controversy arose that almost destroyed Christianity forever. It wasn't Roman persecution or political disputes, but something far more dangerous. A radical interpretation that rejected half of the Bible. This heresy not only divided Christian communities but forced the church to make decisions that shaped our faith to this day. A wealthy and influential man arrived in Rome with a revolutionary proposal. The God of the Old Testament was a cruel impostor, and Jesus came to liberate us from him. His ideas spread like wildfire, gaining thousands of followers throughout the empire. Bishops were alarmed, communities were divided, and the future of Christianity hung precariously in the balance. If you want to understand how the biblical canon was truly born and discover secrets few know about the formation of the early church, hit the notification bell and leave your like now. This story will shock you. Prepare to learn truths that have been hidden for almost 2,000 years and still cause heated debates today. His name was Marcion of Sinope, and his influence was so devastating that church fathers dedicated decades to combating his ideas. He wasn't just any heretic, he possessed wealth, charisma, and seemingly irrefutable logic. When he arrived in Rome around 140 AD, no one imagined they were facing the greatest doctrinal challenge of the early centuries. But why were his ideas so dangerous? And how did one man manage to shake the foundations of an entire religion? The answer lies in a radical interpretation of the scriptures that still sends shivers down scholars' spines today. Marcion had found what he considered a fatal contradiction at the heart of Christianity. Marcion was not a scholar in an office, but an extremely prosperous maritime merchant from Sinope in Pontus. The son of a bishop, he grew up immersed in Christian traditions, but his questioning mind soon identified problems others preferred to ignore. His wealth gave him the independence to explore controversial ideas without fearing immediate economic or social consequences. While studying Paul's letters alongside the available Gospels, Marcion became disturbed by an issue he considered unsolvable. How could the loving God preached by Jesus be the same violent and vengeful God of the Old Testament? For him, this contradiction was not superficial, but revealed a shocking truth that no one dared to admit. Marcion's solution was as simple as it was radical. They were two completely different gods. The God of the Old Testament was the demiurge, an inferior, cruel, and legalistic creator. Jesus represented the supreme God, unknown until then, who came to free us from the tyranny of the creator God. This revelation, according to Marcion, explained all the apparent contradictions in the scriptures. Armed with this revolutionary theory and a considerable fortune, Marcion set out for Rome, determined to reform Christianity. He arrived in the imperial capital around 140 AD and immediately began spreading his ideas through generous donations and compelling lectures. His first strategy was to gain the trust of local Christian leaders. Initially, he was met with enthusiasm by the Roman community. His financial generosity and knowledge of the scriptures impressed many bishops. But as his ideas became clearer, the situation changed drastically. What began as a civil theological discussion soon turned into a battle for the soul of Christianity. Marcion's argumentation was not based on mystical visions or secret revelations, but on a cold and systematic analysis of the scriptures. He compiled detailed lists of the differences between the Old and New Testaments, creating such a shocking contrast that many were left speechless. His logic seemed irrefutable to minds not trained in theological subtleties. In the Old Testament, Marcion argued, "We find a God who orders genocides, establishes strict laws, punishes severely, and shows preference for a chosen people. In the New Testament, Jesus preaches universal love, unconditional forgiveness, mercy for all, and rejection of violence. How can these glaring differences be reconciled without admitting we are talking about completely distinct divinities?" To strengthen his arguments, Marcion cited specific passages where Jesus seemed to directly contradict the Old Testament. "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you," became his favorite ammunition. According to his interpretation, Jesus was not fulfilling the law, but rejecting it entirely. The Sermon on the Mount was a declaration of war against the God of Sinai. Marcion also questioned why an omniscient God would create an imperfect world, establish laws he knew were impossible to keep, and then regret his decisions. To him, this proved that the Creator was an inferior God, well-intentioned perhaps, but limited and flawed. The true supreme God would never make such mistakes or display such emotional weaknesses. His criticisms didn't stop at theology, but also attacked practical issues that bothered many Christians. Why circumcision? Why dietary laws? Why bloody sacrifices? If Jesus abolished all of that, Marcion argued, it was because he came from a different God, opposed to the legalistic system of the Old Testament. This line of reasoning quickly won over thousands of followers. Marcion was not content with just theories, he acted decisively and practically. He created the first official Christian canon in history, establishing which books should be considered authentically Christian. His list was drastically shorter than the current Bible, only 10 letters of Paul and an edited version of the Gospel of Luke, removing all references to the Old Testament. According to Marcion, Paul was the only apostle who truly understood Jesus' message. The other apostles, including Peter, remained trapped in Judaism and contaminated Christianity with elements of the Old Testament. Therefore, only the genuinely Pauline letters deserved to be preserved. As for the Gospels, only Luke escaped Judaizing corruption. But even then, careful edits were needed. The Gospel of Marcion was a drastically edited version of Luke, removing Jesus' genealogy, references to the virgin birth, quotations from the Old Testament, and any passages that connected Jesus to the God of Israel. The result was a Jesus who appeared mysteriously in the world, with no prior history, preaching a completely new and unknown God. This radical edition of the Scriptures was not presented as censorship, but as a restoration of the original text. Marcion claimed that the manuscripts had been corrupted by Jewish Christians who inserted false connections to the Old Testament. His clean version revealed Jesus' true message, free from the Judaic contaminations that obscured the revelation of the supreme God. The impact was immense and immediate. Entire communities adopted the Marcionite canon, rejecting all other Christian texts as corrupt or false. For the first time in history, there was an official, clear, and coherent Christian Bible. Ironically, it was this heresy that forced the Orthodox Church to define its own canon in response. When Roman bishops finally understood the extent of Marcion's ideas, alarm spread throughout Christianity. This was not a minor dispute over doctrinal details, but an existential threat that could completely destroy the continuity between Judaism and Christianity. If Marcion was right, the entire history of salvation would have to be rewritten from scratch. Polycrates, Justin Martyr, and other important leaders began writing urgent treatises against Marcionism. They realized they faced a formidable adversary, intellectually brilliant, financially powerful, and with arguments that resonated with the real doubts of many Christians. The refutation could not be superficial or emotional, but required a deep and systematic theological response. The situation became even more dramatic when it was discovered that Marcionite communities were rapidly spreading throughout the Roman Empire. They weren't just small groups of dissenters, but organized congregations with their own bishops, liturgies, and ecclesiastical structures. Marcionism was becoming a parallel church, directly competing with traditional Christianity. In 144 AD, the leaders of the Roman Church made a drastic decision. Marcion was formally excommunicated, and his generous donation of 200,000 sesterces was returned. This extreme measure demonstrated how dangerous his ideas were considered. The Church rarely rejected wealthy benefactors. The return of the money signaled that no compromise would be accepted. But excommunication did not stop Marcion. On the contrary, it freed him to develop his alternative church without restrictions. Far from Rome, he established a network of Marcionite communities that flourished for decades. His ideas continued to spread, forcing the Orthodox Church into a doctrinal war that would last over a century. Marcion's doctrine went far beyond a simple rejection of the Old Testament. It presented a complete cosmology that explained the existence of evil, human suffering, and the purpose of life. According to his theology, there were three levels of divine reality: the supreme God, good; the demiurge, just but limited; and demonic powers, evil. This hierarchy explained the apparent contradictions of the world. The demiurge created the material world and established Mosaic law, acting within his limited understanding of justice. He was not evil, but ignorant of the supreme God. His laws were valid at his level, but became obstacles when the true God revealed himself through Jesus. Salvation consisted of completely transcending the system created by the demiurge and its material limitations. Jesus was not born of a woman, nor did he possess a real physical body. He was a direct manifestation of the supreme God who only appeared to be human. This doctrine, called docetism, explained how Jesus could be fully divine without any contamination from the inferior material creation. His death on the cross was real in its salvific effects, but did not involve genuine physical suffering. Marcionite salvation was radically different from Christian orthodoxy. It was not based on repentance of sins or obedience to the law, but on Gnostic recognition of the truth about the two gods. Once enlightened, the soul could completely transcend the material world and unite with the supreme God. There was no final judgment, only progressive liberation from cosmic ignorance. Want to understand how these revolutionary ideas conquered half the Roman Empire? Leave your comment about which aspect of Marcionism intrigues you the most. The rejection of the Old Testament, the doctrine of two gods, or something else? Let's explore together these theological mysteries that shook the ancient world and still provoke intense academic debates today. Faced with the growing threat, the Church developed its first systematic anti-heretical campaign in history. Tertullian, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and other top theologians dedicated years of their lives to meticulously refuting every aspect of Marcionite doctrine. Their treatises, Adversus Marcionum, became models for all future Christian polemics against heresies. The Orthodox strategy focused on three main lines of attack. First, to demonstrate the essential continuity between the Old and New Testaments through typology and fulfilled prophecies. Second, to prove that apparent contradictions could be harmonized through adequate allegorical and contextual interpretation. Third, to expose the dangerous practical consequences of Marcionite doctrine for Christian moral life. Tertullian developed particularly brilliant arguments against the doctrine of two gods. If the supreme God was perfectly good and omnipotent, why did he allow the demiurge to create an imperfect world and establish inadequate laws? Why didn't he intervene sooner? His delay in revealing himself suggested either ignorance of the situation or an inability to correct it, both incompatible with divine perfection. Irenaeus attacked the Marcionite mutilation of the scriptures, arguing that removing inconvenient passages was methodologically invalid. If the texts were corrupted by Jewish Christians, how could Marcion be sure that his purified portions had escaped the same corruption? The arbitrary selection of favorable passages did not constitute proof of authenticity, but a demonstration of doctrinal prejudice. The Church Fathers also explored the disturbing practical implications of Marcionism. If the material world was the creation of an inferior God, what motivation did Christians have for charity work, caring for the poor, or social responsibility? Marcionite disdain for physical creation could lead to moral antinomianism and the disintegration of the Christian community. One of the weakest points of Marcionite theology was its explanation for the problem of evil. If the supreme God was infinitely good and powerful, why did he allow his creatures to suffer under the demiurge's imperfect system? Marcion argued that the supreme God was completely transcendent and did not interfere until he sent Jesus. But this explanation created new, unsolvable philosophical problems. If human suffering under the demiurge's laws did not concern the supreme God for millennia, his goodness was questionable. If it concerned him but he could not intervene, his omnipotence was limited. If he could intervene but chose not to until a certain point, his timing seemed arbitrary. Any Marcionite answer compromised some essential divine attribute, creating theological dilemmas worse than the original problems. Tertullian relentlessly explored these contradictions, asking why the supreme God waited so long to reveal himself if he truly cared about his creatures. The Marcionite answer that he was hidden merely shifted the problem. A loving God who hides while his creatures suffer demonstrates defective love or limited power. Both alternatives contradicted the claimed divine perfection. The issue became even more complicated when applied to soteriology. If Jesus saved only a few people from his generation onwards, what justice was there for all previous generations who suffered under the demiurge without knowing the supreme God? Marcionite salvation seemed arbitrarily limited in time and space, incompatible with universal divine goodness. Orthodox defenders argued that only the traditional doctrine of divine unity adequately resolved the problem of evil. The same God who allowed temporary suffering had higher reasons related to a greater salvific plan, culminating in redemption through Christ. Classical Christian theodicy, though mysterious, was more coherent than the Marcionite dualistic solution. Although officially defeated, Marcionism left deep and lasting marks on Christianity that few perceive today. The very formation of the biblical canon was a direct response to the Marcionite challenge. Without Marcion, we might never have had an official list of sacred books. Ironically, the greatest heretic of the early church forced orthodoxy to define itself with unprecedented precision. The later Christian emphasis on the unity of the two testaments largely developed as an antidote to Marcionite dualism. Hermeneutical methods such as typology, allegory, and prophetic fulfillment gained theological sophistication through anti-Marcionite debates. Modern Christian exegesis owes much to the interpretive tools forged in the heat of this specific controversy. Many doctrines that we consider fundamentally Christian were articulated for the first time during the anti-Marcionite polemic. The real incarnation of Christ, the divine inspiration of the Old Testament, the continuity of salvation history, and the essential goodness of material creation received precise formulations as direct responses to Marcionite challenges. Marcionism also profoundly influenced the development of ecclesiastical structure. The need to combat organized heresies led to the strengthening of episcopal authority, the development of standardized creeds, and doctrinal centralization. The Catholic Church as a unified institution emerged partly as a response to the threat of alternative movements like Marcionism. Elements of Marcionite thought persisted disguised in various later heresies. Gnostic dualism, Christological Docetism, moral antinomianism, and the rejection of material creation reappeared constantly in Christian history. Each new manifestation of these tendencies echoed, consciously or not, aspects of Marcion's original theological revolution. What many don't know is that Marcionism did not disappear quickly after its founder's excommunication. On the contrary, it flourished as an independent religious movement for over 3 centuries, establishing a complete ecclesiastical hierarchy that directly rivaled the Orthodox Church. In many regions of the empire, especially in the East, Marcionite communities outnumbered Catholic congregations. Marcionite churches had their own bishops, presbyters, deacons, and elaborate liturgical structures. They developed their own hymnals, alternative liturgical calendars, and sacramental practices adapted to their distinctive theology. They were not marginal sects, but sophisticated religious organizations that offered a complete alternative to traditional Christianity for thousands of faithful. Moral discipline in Marcionite communities was notoriously strict, often surpassing that of Orthodox churches. They emphasized celibacy, prolonged fasting, material simplicity, and rejection of worldly pleasures. This austerity attracted Christians seeking a more intense spiritual life than offered by conventional Christianity, especially after its imperial officialization in the 4th century. Marcionite missionaries traveled to remote regions of Central Asia, establishing communities that survived until the medieval period. Some sources suggest that Marcionite elements influenced religious developments in Persia and beyond, creating unique theological syncretisms. The geographical reach of Marcionism rivaled that of Orthodox Christianity during its peak. The persistence and success of Marcionism forced the Catholic Church to constantly refine its doctrinal positions and missionary strategies. It was no longer enough to theoretically refute heresies. It was necessary to offer a more attractive practical alternative. This intense religious competition accelerated theological and ecclesiastical developments that shaped medieval Christianity. One of the tragedies of Christian history is that almost all original Marcionite writings were deliberately destroyed by the Orthodox. We know their doctrines primarily through the refutations of their enemies, an obviously biased source that may have distorted or exaggerated certain aspects. Recent archaeological discoveries, however, have begun to reveal fragments that show a more complex reality. The Gospel of Marcion remains a fascinating mystery. Although commonly described as an edited Luke, some modern scholars suggest it could represent an independent textual tradition, perhaps older than our current canonical Gospels. If true, this would revolutionize our understanding of the formation of New Testament texts and the early history of Christianity. Papyrus fragments discovered in Egypt contain excerpts of Marcionite literature that differ significantly from the descriptions made by their Orthodox critics. These texts show a more nuanced theology, less radical than the caricature preserved in anti-heretical treatises. Some passages demonstrate sophisticated attempts to reconcile apparent contradictions within their own doctrine. Letters attributed to later Marcionite leaders reveal internal doctrinal developments that were never documented by Orthodox adversaries. The movement evolved theologically far beyond Marcion's original formulations, developing responses to Orthodox criticisms and adapting to new cultural contexts. This dynamic evolution suggests considerable intellectual vitality. Even more intriguing are references to secret Marcionite texts mentioned in some manuscripts. Apparently, certain advanced doctrines were reserved only for high-level initiates, creating a hierarchical knowledge structure similar to Gnostic systems. These esoteric teachings may have contained even more radical theological speculations than the known public doctrines. Marcion developed revolutionary methods of biblical interpretation that anticipated modern critical techniques by over 1,000 years. His historical critical approach to the scriptures, although motivated by theological prejudices, utilized surprisingly sophisticated hermeneutical principles for his time. He analyzed textual inconsistencies, internal contradictions, and authorship problems with almost scientific rigor. His work on the Pauline epistles demonstrated impressive textual knowledge. Marcion identified interpolations, editorial additions, and manuscript corruptions with remarkable accuracy. Many of his conclusions about the primitive state of Pauline texts have been confirmed by modern scholars using completely independent methods. His philological intuition was extraordinarily sharp. Marcion's theory of Judaizing textual corruption, although exaggerated, contained valid insights into the process of manuscript transmission. He correctly recognized that Christian scribes sometimes harmonized conflicting texts, added clarifying explanations, and inserted cross-references. His methodological suspicion about premature textual unanimity was fundamentally correct. Marcion also pioneered the use of internal criteria for evaluating textual authenticity. He argued that passages inconsistent with the general theological character of an author were likely later additions. This principle, refined and applied more carefully, became a standard tool in modern textual criticism. His methodological contribution was unintentionally valuable. Ironically, the critical methods developed by Marcion to purify the scriptures from supposed Judaic corruptions were later adapted by Orthodox scholars to defend traditional textual integrity. The hermeneutical tools forged in the Marcionite controversy benefited both sides of the debate, permanently enriching Christian exegesis. One of the most disturbing dimensions of Marcionism was its moral ambiguity. On one hand, his followers practiced rigorous asceticism and demonstrated genuine spiritual sincerity that often surpassed that of Orthodox Christians. On the other hand, his theology could justify radical antinomianism and disregard for the established social order. This tension was never adequately resolved. Marcionite doctrine of salvation by gnosis rather than moral works created a fundamental ethical paradox. If enlightenment about the two gods was sufficient for salvation, what incentive existed for moral behavior? Some Marcionite groups developed deliberate libertinism, arguing that actions performed in the demiurge's material world were irrelevant to spiritual destinies determined by knowledge of the supreme God. Other Marcionites went in the opposite direction, embracing extreme asceticism as a way to completely reject the demiurge's creation. They practiced strict celibacy, strict vegetarianism, and voluntary poverty. Some groups prohibited marriage and encouraged suicide as the final liberation from material imprisonment. This ethical variety within the movement demonstrated fundamental doctrinal incoherence. Marcionite theology also created problems for Christian social ethics. If the material world was the creation of an inferior God, what obligation did the faithful have to improve social conditions, care for the poor, or seek justice? Many Marcionite communities became isolationist sects that rejected responsibility for the well-being of wider society. Orthodox critics relentlessly explored these moral contradictions, arguing that any theological system that produced such inconsistent ethical outcomes must be fundamentally flawed. Marcion's inability to develop a coherent ethic became one of his most exploited vulnerabilities by apologetic adversaries. Although historical Marcionism has disappeared, its central questions have repeatedly resurfaced in later Christian theology. The tension between divine justice and mercy, the relationship between the Old and New Testaments, and the problem of reconciling a loving God with seemingly severe biblical texts continue to challenge contemporary Christians. Marcion identified real dilemmas that have never been completely resolved. Radical Protestant movements often developed semi-Marcionite tendencies, emphasizing the New Testament over the Old, questioning the relevance of Mosaic laws, and contrasting the Old Testament God of wrath with the New Testament God of love. Although they rejected Marcion's explicit dualism, they replicated many of his basic theological impulses. Modern liberal theology sometimes echoes Marcionite concerns by questioning the historicity of violent Old Testament narratives, reinterpreting divine anthropomorphisms as primitive human projections, and emphasizing progressive revelation culminating in Jesus. Contemporary critical methods, ironically, have validated some of Marcion's original textual insights about manuscript corruptions and interpolations. Contemporary debates on biblical hermeneutics often reproduce the Marcionite controversy in new guises. Discussions on literalism versus contextual interpretation, continuity versus discontinuity between the testaments, and the role of ancient culture in textual formation echo questions first raised by this second-century heresy. The periodic resurgence of Marcionite themes in Christian history suggests that Marcion identified genuine tensions in biblical theology that resist easy solutions. Although his answers were inadequate, his questions remain relevant. The persistence of these issues demonstrates the continued need for sophisticated theological reflection on problems he pioneered. The Marcionite controversy was not merely an academic theological dispute, but reflected deep cultural conflicts about Christian identity in the Greco-Roman world. Marcion articulated anti-Jewish sentiments that already existed in many Gentile communities, offering a sophisticated theological justification for cultural discomfort with the Jewish roots of Christianity. The Church's response was swift. Bishops from Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch joined forces against what they considered the greatest threat to nascent Christianity. Justin Martyr was one of the first to directly confront Marcionite teachings, denouncing them as dangerous distortions of the true faith. His writings reveal the panic that gripped traditional Christian leadership. Irenaeus of Lyon dedicated years of his life to combating Marcionism through his theological works. In Against Heresies, he methodically dismantled every argument of Marcion, defending the unity between the Old and New Testaments. His writings show how the early church was forced to develop more sophisticated theology to respond to Marcionite challenges. The pressure was immense. Tertullian, the fierce Christian apologist, wrote 5 entire books refuting Marcion and his followers. His words were sharp as blades, calling the heresiarch the rat of Pontus and accusing him of mutilating the scriptures. Tertullian knew he was fighting for the very soul of Christianity, and his passion shone through in every line of his writings against the Marcionite movement. The Church realized it needed more than theological arguments to combat the growing influence of Marcionism. A systematic process of defining the biblical canon then began, establishing which books would be considered sacred and inspired. It was a direct response to Marcion's reduced canon, a desperate attempt to preserve the entire Judeo-Christian tradition. But there was something deeper at stake in this theological battle. Christianity's very identity was being questioned and redefined. Would it be a completely new religion, disconnected from its Jewish roots, or the natural continuation of the salvation history initiated in the Old Testament? The answer would determine the future of all Christendom for centuries to come. Although Marcionism was officially condemned and persecuted, its impact on the formation of Orthodox Christianity was profound and lasting. The Church was forced to articulate its doctrines on the nature of God, the relationship between the Testaments, and the interpretation of Scripture with greater precision. In a sense, Marcion forced Christianity to grow and mature theologically at an accelerated pace. The biblical canonization process was directly influenced by the Marcionite threat. The need to establish an official list of sacred books became urgent when Christians encountered radically different versions of the Scriptures. The New Testament canon, as we know it today, owes much to the reaction against the reduced canon of Marcion and his followers. Centuries later, echoes of Marcionite thought resurfaced in different Christian movements. The medieval Cathars shared similar views on the evil nature of the material world. Some Protestant reformers flirted with ideas reminiscent of Marcionite dualism. Even modern theologians occasionally rediscover aspects of Marcion's thought, showing its continuing relevance. The fundamental question raised by Marcion has never been fully resolved: how to reconcile the apparent difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God revealed by Jesus Christ. Different Christian traditions have developed varied answers, but the tension remains. Contemporary theologians still grapple with the same dilemmas that plagued second-century Christians. Marcionism reminds us that early Christianity was not a monolithic block, but a complex mosaic of different interpretations and understandings of Christ's message. The version that prevailed was just one among many historical possibilities. Understanding this initial diversity is essential for grasping the richness and complexity of the Christian tradition. Today, when we look back through the centuries, we can see Marcionism not just as a condemned heresy, but as a mirror reflecting fundamental questions about faith, biblical interpretation, and religious identity. Marcion's questions continue to echo in contemporary theological debates about divine violence, justice, and mercy, continuity and discontinuity between religious traditions. Marcion's story teaches us about the power of ideas and how they can shape and reshape entire religious traditions. A single man, armed only with his radical interpretation of the Scriptures, managed to divide Christianity and force lasting changes in its theological structure. This demonstrates both the vulnerability and the vitality of religious traditions in their formative stages. If this journey through early Christian history has sparked your curiosity, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more content on the mysteries and controversies that shaped our faith. Share this video with someone who needs to know these fascinating stories. For modern Christians, Marcionism serves as a reminder of the importance of dialogue between different biblical interpretations and theological traditions. It also highlights the need to balance fidelity to Scripture with openness to legitimate questioning and critical reflection. Orthodoxy should not fear questioning, but use it as an opportunity for deepening and growth. Marcion's true legacy can be found not in his specific answers, but in the profound questions he raised about the nature of God, the interpretation of Scripture, and Christian identity. These questions remain relevant today, challenging each generation of believers to seek a deeper and more mature understanding of their faith, always remembering that truth emerges not from fear of questioning, but from courageous engagement with the most difficult questions.